For 18 years, he was on morning radio here in Los Angeles on K-Rock's The Kevin and Bean Show. So if you had a commute, you probably know his voice. Now he hosts a podcast of his own creation called The Ralph Report, and it's every day. He also hosts with Kevin Smith, the film director and writer, podcast called Hollywood Babylon, and that's been, I think, over 9 years long, 9 years going. He hosted all 3 seasons of Spike TV's successful faux reality comedy show, The Joe Smo Show. Say that sentence. You may have heard him as one of the many characters he voices on Family Guy each week. Next up for Ralph is the Jay and Silent Bob reboot, which he is just back from New Orleans filming. So please help me in welcoming Ralph Garman.
Thanks so much to the Social Media Club for having me here tonight.
Thank you, Ralph.
Thank you. I hope I can learn the secret handshake or whatever else comes along with the club membership. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's a pleasure to talk about podcasts because that is my life now. And we'll do a Q&A, right, in case anybody has any questions about my life in radio or podcasts. I'll be happy to answer if I can, but it's a pleasure to be here.
Great.
What's going on?
Well, why don't we just talk about, can you talk a little bit about starting in radio and making the transition to podcasts? Like, how did that happen for you? How did you decide podcast?
I didn't right away decide podcasts. I had some experience with podcasts initially because I developed a friendship and then professional relationship with Kevin Smith, as you mentioned. Kevin and I became friends initially because he would be a guest on the Kevin and Bean Show on K-Rock when I worked there. And we hit it off and became fast friends, and we decided we wanted to work together. So the plan was we would do a show based on the week in pop culture and showbiz news, basically. I had a recurring segment on the Kevin and Bean Show called The Showbiz Beat. And whenever Kevin would come by to promote a movie or whatever, I would have him sit in with me because he was so funny and we just hit it off so well. Our chemistry was really obviously clicking, so we thought we would take that segment and expand it into a 2-hour weekly radio show. Initially, it was supposed to be a radio show. And I said, Kevin and Smith and I would like to do a radio show. Give us your worst time slot. Give us 2 o'clock on a Sunday night. Give us, Saturday mornings, whatever you got. Just give us 2 hours, and we're going to do a show. It's going to feature comedy and entertainment news and things like that. And he said, okay, do a sample show so I can hear what it would be like. So Kevin and I went into a studio and we recorded what we thought would be good. And I gave it to the program director. And he said, nobody wants to hear anyone talk to each other anymore. Radio is now all about music. No one wants to hear anybody talk anymore. That's dead. That will never come back. And now here we're talking about podcasts, which all it is people talking to each other and about each other. So what Kevin and I did was, obviously the radio station didn't want us, so we said, well, screw it. Kevin had already started a podcast called Smodcast with his production partner, Scott Mosier. And so he was looking to add a few more to a potential podcast network. And so that's when we started Hollywood Babylon, and that was, almost 9 years now. And we've always done it in front of a live audience. We do it usually at the Improv on Melrose in West Hollywood. But we've traveled, luckily I get to piggyback on Kevin Smith's fan base, which is international. But we have taken Hollywood Babylon, a podcast, and traveled around the world with it. We performed in London and Dublin, Ireland, and Canada, and all over the United States. And we sell out venues, believe it or not, even larger than this one. And, and we have a great time doing it. And it turns out people do want to hear other people talking to each other, and they do want to hear people talking about subjects that interest them. And so, maybe that's why radio is struggling now, because they didn't understand that if you have a point of view and you have something worth talking about, you can find an audience for that. Yeah? And then my own personal podcast, The Ralph Report, that came about purely as a necessity because K-Rock shit canned me. They inspired me. There's no kids here, right? They gave me the boot after 18 years, and I was like, all right, this is a surprise. First of all, that was my reaction. And then I've got a little girl, and I've got a house payment, and how am I going to earn now? And so...
The natural choice is start a podcast.
Well, it isn't. No, it's not, because as everyone knows who started one, that can be a struggle, right? But I thought, initially, okay, well, go work for another radio station. But the problem is terrestrial radio is really struggling. And there weren't any morning show availabilities. And the people, I talked to several stations in town, and they just weren't in a position, or they were reluctant to do what I wanted to do ultimately. And so it just came to me. I said, you know what, we live in a world now where you don't need anyone's permission to reach an audience anymore. You don't need a gatekeeper, you don't need a network, you don't need a radio station. You can directly reach out to people and deliver your product to them, and you can rise or fall based on the merits of that product. So, and admittedly, I had the good fortune of having had an audience in Los Angeles for almost 18 years, and another one with Kevin Smith for almost 9. And I said, I'm going to start my own thing, and hopefully people will show up, and they did. So.
How long did it take for people to show up after you first did your first episode, and you're excited, and are you at your house doing the first episode?
Yeah, I work out of my house now.
You're at your house, and you release the first episode, and then what happens?
I didn't really release the first episode, it escaped. That was the problem. I had to hunt it down and bring it back. It was hard because, well, anyone knows, I mean, the Social Media Club would certainly know this, that it's hard to cut through the noise and get to people and let them know you exist. Even me, we had obviously untold listeners on K-Rock after all those years, and another whole bunch of people who listened to Hollywood Babylon. We were in the top 20 on iTunes a lot with the show I do with Kevin Smith. And so I figured if I can tap into a fraction of that audience, I'll be okay. I should have been more specific and said a large fraction of that audience, because I do have a fraction of that audience, but it's not huge.
Was K-Rock helpful in moving people over to listen to your podcast?
No, after they declared me dead, I don't think really they were interested in helping. No, that's been a strange relationship. K-Rock has pretty much would like me to not exist anymore. I'm not mentioned, and they got in their defense, they got a bunch of blowback from people after I was let go, and there was a lot of fans who were very upset with that decision. And I think rather than deal with that, they think it's better just to pretend I don't exist, and then that way they don't have to deal with that, you know? So they were not helpful in promoting the Ralph Report. Kevin Smith was very much so. But I, like a lot of people, I have to use all the traditional methods. You got to do Facebook, and you got to do Twitter and Instagram, and you just try to use whatever tools you can to get the word out there. Because I've had people come up to me, and we've been doing the Ralph Report. K-Rock let me go at the end of November of 2017. I got my first episode of my own podcast up and out towards the end of January of 2018, so less than 3 months. And I still run into people who were fans of mine from the radio show and say, so what are you doing now? Whatever happened to you? And I'm like, just go to patreon.com and sign up, you know?
Yeah, I was going to ask you, how do people find your podcast? Because your model's a little bit different. It's not, we'll talk about that in a minute, but how does a new listener find you?
Luckily, I have a very engaged fan base, either through Kevin Smith or through the K-Rock years, or however I found them. And they have dubbed themselves the Garmy, God bless them. And so it really has been word of mouth, you know, one by one. They're starting to tell each other, and it's been slow growth, but it's been growth, and that's what you look for. You know, it's going in the right direction. We're getting more and more listeners all the time. So it's just a matter of sticking with it and ideally producing content that you're happy with, that you're proud of. Because at the end of the day, no matter who shows up, if you don't deliver and give them a show worth listening to, then they won't stick around for long. You know?
So how would you say that your transition from podcast to radio was in terms of creative output, and how is your podcast, is it like your radio show, or do you have to do things differently?
I tried to do it very differently at the outset, because I had worked with Kevin and Bean on that show and a crew of other people. I mean, you heard sort of the clip at the top of this thing where I was talking to Jimmy Kimmel. I mean, Jimmy and I worked together on K-Rock before he left to go do television, and I've got a long family of people that I've had experiences with. So I've always been working with others. Even with Kevin Smith, it's sort of a double act that he and I do. And I thought with this show, I should do something really different, and I'll just be one man, one microphone. You know, it'll just be me and my opinions and my attitudes, and this will be refreshing for people, and they'll really enjoy it because it's unique. They didn't like any of that. early on people said, yeah, it's okay, but what happened to the funny stuff where you make fun of other people and there's a lot of back and forth and things like that? So it dawned on me pretty early that I needed another voice in the room. So there's a stand-up comedian friend of mine named Eddie Pence that I brought in to be sort of my sidekick, and I bounced stuff off of him. And the energy is better that way, and the dynamic is better. So the show has changed considerably, even just in the past year that it's been existing. And that has been a learning curve. The whole thing's been a learning curve. It's one thing to do a radio show where you're surrounded by a staff and a crew of people who handle stuff technically and otherwise for you. And then when you open up your own shop, it's like working at Walmart and then starting a five and dime on the corner of your local neighborhood where you're selling, stuff that people may not want to buy. It's terrifying. But you learn, and you learn quickly if you're smart, and you adjust,
Yeah, I think a lot of people in the podcast business today found their way there from another place, and so since the industry's just becoming an industry, a lot of us have made the transition from a big company to being an entrepreneur as a podcaster or having a podcast network. Was that a tough transition, just the going from all that support? Or what can you talk a little bit about the good, the bad?
Creatively, I knew what I wanted to do and where I was going. I mean, I've been talking into a microphone for almost 2 decades, so I knew I could do that. The tough part for me was a lot of it was the technical stuff, editing your own stuff and what microphones to get and what software to use for sound editing. I mean, I was so lucky. Prior to that, I'd work at a radio station. If you said, all right, I need a circus, and I want to hear a lion roar, and can you get me a lady screaming, she's being eaten by the lion? And I would turn around, and 10 minutes later, our sound guy had whipped together this amazing audio production for me to use in a comedy bit or something. Now, I'm the guy who's got to do all that stuff, and it's a learning curve. You have to learn how to do that. And that compounded with the creative and trying to, my podcast, I don't know if people know or not, it's an hour every day. I do a daily podcast, a morning show every day for an hour. And that was a conscious decision because I wanted to deliver whatever it is that I do that people like in a way that they were somewhat used to. And a lot of people, especially here in Los Angeles, were used to hearing me 5 days a week on their drive into work or school. So I wanted to try to replicate that delivery system for that. So there's a lot of content that has to be created every day, and then on top of it, I have to do all the technical stuff, and it's been a challenge for sure.
How many people are on your team helping you make it? Is it just you doing all that? You said you have a sidekick.
Right, he helps me in the room when I'm recording, and then once that's over, it's all on me, and I got to put it all together.
So you're at the cash register at the general store, and you're behind the...
Yes, and I'm stocking the shelves, and I'm bagging groceries, and yeah.
So what does your day as a podcaster look like? What are you sitting behind? Do you have a bunch of buttons in front of you? What kind of software are you using? How does that look?
I have a space in my house that used to be my office and now is sort of a makeshift studio. And I've got 3 microphones set up with a mixing board, and I run everything into a desktop computer directly into it. I know some people use sort of a digital recorder and then they'll take that SD card and they'll transfer it over to a computer and do their editing. I cut out the middleman and I run everything right into my computer because it's there. And then I will edit on that using a suite of software. I mean, I don't know if people want specifics, but it's called NCH, and it comes out of Australia, and they've got a whole suite of video and audio software that you can sort of buy in a package. And it's very good for dumb people like myself, and very simple and very point and click and stuff, not very complicated. So that's what I use mostly. But the day for me starts, I get out of bed and I'm already on the computer researching, because I do a daily entertainment news segment as well, so I have to find out all that stuff, and anything that happens during the day, I need to start putting that stuff together. And I also do celebrity interviews, so sometimes I'm researching those. And then I'm pulling actualities, I'm pulling audio for people's, I do a celebrity birthday segment, so if someone is in a band, I'll pull the song from that band. And there's a lot of bits and pieces and audio that needs to be collected, and depending on the schedules of myself and my sidekick, we'll lay down the actual hour or so of audio, and then I'll start cutting that, tightening it up, sweetening it, adding production elements, sound effects, music, that sort of thing. And then I deliver it by 5 a.m. Pacific time every day. So it's a whole day. It's a full day. I'm working harder than I ever have, and I hate it. I hate it. I wish there were a lot of people doing all the hard work for me so I could just be a diva comedian guy like I used to be and just say funny things and let other people record it and worry about it, but it's not the case.
Well, that's interesting too, because you chose, rather than going with an ad-supported business model, like lots of other podcasts, you are behind a paywall. So
right.
People can't even listen unless they become a member or become a contributor?
Well, what we do is, I'm with Patreon.com, which a lot of people know is it is a subscription-based service for all kinds of artists, not just podcasts, but also photographers and writers and fine artists, all kinds of stuff. It was started by a guy named Jack Conte, who was an artist himself. He's a musician. And he thought that art has value. If you create something, you should be able to monetize that because it has value. And he thought everybody was throwing everything for free out there in the internet, and he thought that was unfair to the creators. So he created this system where you can set up your own pay system and find the sweet spot for your own audience and what they're willing to pay to get what you do. So I decided to go with that model versus the advertising model, because I had done advertising and still do advertising with Hollywood Babylon, the podcast I do with Kevin Smith. And I know that on a good week, we'll be in the top 20 on iTunes, and we're also available on Stitcher and all the usual places you get podcasts. And so we reach sometimes several 100,000 listeners. And I also know what Sherry's Berries is giving us to do a spot. And it's not all that much money. You know, there's still a ways to go before the advertisers who use podcasts make it worth the while, unless you're a massive machine like Joe Rogan or Adam Carolla or one of these people. In order to make a living as a podcaster is really difficult. So I was lucky. I had this audience that I had spent so much time with for 18 years on radio, another 8, 9 years with Kevin Smith. I said, if those folks will show up, if they like what I do and they show up and they're willing to part with 15 cents a day to hear my show, then I can monetize that and make not the living I used to, but I can survive on that, And so that was the plan initially, was to go with subscription-based versus advertising, strictly because I was hoping I could tap into an existing audience, which not everybody has the luxury of having. I realize I'm lucky that way.
Right. Not only an audience, it's hard enough for some people to find podcasts, but people that are willing to find your podcast and then pay to listen to it. So
yeah, getting people to reach in their pockets for anything on the internet is tough. But I think it's changing because people are getting more and more used to boutique entertainment delivery. The networks now are going through it with television. People are picking up, if you like DC Comics, you go to the DC Universe streaming service and you pay them monthly for the content that they provide, or you pay for Hulu and you pay for Netflix. And there's a lot of boutique entertainment delivery out there now for visual entertainment, and I think people are getting used to that model now, so it's easier to get them to say, yeah, I like listening to this guy 5 days a week on my way into work. He's worth a couple bucks a month. I think so.
Are there other ways to make money outside of what happens on the air, so to speak, in the podcast, in terms of advertising or people paying to listen? How else can a podcaster make money? Prostitution,
that's what I've found, yeah, mostly. I'll be in the alley, by the way, after the show, in case anybody wants to come. Well, there's merch, of course, we've got t-shirts and iPhone cases and mouse pads and all that kind of stuff with this logo on it and a bunch of other things. I've also tried to, and I think it's good advice for anyone who's getting into the podcast game, is what sets you apart, what makes you different? It's crazy now how many podcasts are out there.
I think over 600,000 of them.
Yeah, that's too many. Yeah, that's ridiculous. Find out what it is that makes you you and try to focus and emphasize that. And because I realized that a lot of people knew, especially from the morning radio show, and also to a certain extent the show I do with Kevin Smith, I'm known for doing silly voices and celebrity impressions and things like that.
Can you give me an example of one of those?
Well, for example, and talking about monetizing, we've got a thing on our website for the podcast that if you want to get someone, let's say, an audio birthday card, right? But you want Arnold Schwarzenegger to say happy birthday to your mother. You can fill out a form and pay the price, and then I will put in your mailbox, happy birthday, mother. Yeah, it's so incredible that you're 92. I can't believe it. You look, well, you look ancient, actually. That's hot. So, one guy had me wake him up as Al Pacino, because he had a hard time getting up in the morning. And so he put it as a ringtone on his phone. That was his alarm. So now when his alarm goes off, he goes, ooh-ah. Come on, Steve. You gotta get up, and you gotta make some fucking money. And he's willing to pay for that.
Yeah, that's super creepy.
Yeah. So I realized that I had that as a marketing tool, and so now I can monetize that aside from the podcast. If you want to pay me to perform like a dancing monkey for you, I will.
Okay, one more request then. Do you do any lady voices?
Not really. My voice is not suited for a lot of female impressions. However, I used to do a character on the radio show we were just talking about in the back. I used to do a black woman.
Hello, be careful.
I'm not doing it anymore. But I did a black woman named LaQuisha, who was a reality television critic. And she would pick the shows specifically where she could make fun of dumb white people, like the Jersey Shore. And she would watch the episode, so people didn't have to. God, that was a bullet to take, I'll tell you. And then come on the Kevin and Bean show and the radio show, and I would review them, review the show. And I'd say, shut up, situation. I would always be angry at whoever it was the dumb white people were on the reality show. So that's the only female character I've ever done. I just don't have the pipes for it. Some guys could do it.
I'm glad I asked you that.
I am too. Because now I've offended a lot of people, so that's good.
Over the course of your experience, what have you found that audiences want?
If I knew that.
They're paying for it.
Well, I don't think you can play that game. It's a fool's errand to try to figure out what the audience wants and then try to make yourself that. I think that's a recipe for disaster. I have a lot of friends of mine who are stand-up comedians, and I revere that profession, and I dabbled in it, but I was never very good, so I got out because I thought the guys who were great never pandered to the audience or worried about what they wanted to hear or what the jokes were that might make them laugh. They got on stage and they told the jokes that they thought were funny, that spoke to what their point of view was, and those were the guys who killed in the room. If you start worrying about, well, geez, everybody likes Fortnite, maybe I should do a Fortnite podcast, or I mean, if you start trying to pander to whatever the current trend is or something, I think you're screwed. So you have to find it is whatever it is that makes you you. Whatever it is that makes you special, whatever expertise or passion you have about a topic, I think that's the way to go if you're going to start a podcast, because that's the only way you can cut through. People will respond to authenticity. I found that, I mean, I started out my career as an actor. I still do a bunch of that. And so naturally, entertainment news and the state of pop culture was something I was already interested in. And I can muster up passion and an interesting point of view on that, and I think that's why people responded to whether I was doing the Showbiz Beat, which was my entertainment news segment on K-Rock, or the thing I do with Kevin Smith, Hollywood Babylon. It's almost all pop culture references and stuff, and that's my wheelhouse, and that's why I think people respond to it, because it's real. I'm not doing a sports show or something, you know?
Yeah, do you have the experience? I've heard some podcasters say that when people meet them in an event or whatever, and they're a podcast fan, it's a different interaction than say this podcaster is also a YouTuber or a former radio person. They say that the interaction is quite a bit different with a fan from video or radio versus the podcast fan. Have you experienced that at all?
You mean more intimate, perhaps?
Yeah.
Is that what you're getting at?
Yeah, I'm kind of getting at that.
You minx.
Do they feel like they know you more?
Well, it's hard to say, because I've always had an intimate relationship with my audience.
All of them.
All of them. I'm exhausted. No, morning radio is very intimate, because usually you are the passenger in the car with those people when they have some hellish commute from Torrance to Santa Clarita or something, you know? And so every day they get used to hearing you. And here's the thing about radio too, is like a daily podcast, there is a voracious appetite for material. You're always trying to fill the air and the time that you have. And so you end up pulling from your own life a lot, you know? And if you're honest and if you're authentic, people get to know you a certain extent. They get to know stories about your family and about your friends and about your history and who you dated and things like that. So they feel like they get to know you. And I always found that, or even early on when I started at K-Rock, people responded to me in a very sort of friendly way, like they considered me a friend. And I think that has been a great strength to have for me moving forward, because those people want to keep that friendship going, and that's been great. Are you guys familiar with the Bonjoro, this app, Bonjoro? You got to get on it. I just discovered it, and it's fucking magical, especially for creators. It is an app that you tie into, you can use it any number of ways. You can tie it into, I do it with Patreon. So every time I get a new subscriber to my podcast, I get a little bling on an app on my phone that says, you have a new subscriber. And through this app called Bonjoro, B-O-N-J-O-R-O, I hit a button and I record a quick welcome video with that person's name, and it's specifically targeted to them. And I hit that button and that is sent into their email box, and they get it right after they subscribe to my show. Let me tell you something. When the guy you just subscribed the show to shows up in your mailbox in a personal video and is thanking you for being there, you make brand loyalty that way. We've been getting so much buzz off of that one app. And that's what I'm talking about. More than just a mass email or a big buy on Facebook or Twitter. If you can start targeting people and cutting through the noise and getting some sort of connection, interaction with people, we've had a lot more success with that kind of thing than we have with anything else.
Yes, ma'am.
So are you always in the same room with either Kevin or someone you might be interviewing when you're doing your podcast? And if not, how is that technically done if that other person is somewhere else?
Yes. I prefer, obviously, to be in the room with someone I'm interviewing. It's not always possible, though, obviously. And I do my interviews a little bit differently than a lot of people do. And I learned this because I hated the way interviews were done on radio. We would get a great guest in on the Kevin and Bean show, and they would sit down and we'd give them 8 minutes, and they would spend the entire 8 minutes talking about the next episode of the show they were in. And I would say, there's so much more interesting stuff to talk to that person about. So when I land a good interview, and I've been so lucky again because of my friendships over the years with people I met through either working with them or having them as guests on the radio. I mean, I would sit down and talk to a guest, and I would get an hour with that person. And then I would take that hour and I just cut it up into 5 segments, and I have them be my guest for the whole week. So every day, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, there's a serialized interview with my special guest. If I've got a real good get, that's the way I give the information out. But if I'm doing a one-off and somebody's got an interesting news story or something and I'm just talking to them, then often I will use Skype. And there's about, 100 great apps out there that will record Skype calls for you, and then you can just download it as an MP3 or as a WAV file, whatever you like to work in, and then you just edit it on your editing software the way you usually do. You can also use a lot of conference call apps and things like that. You can also record those too. So there's almost no reason why you can't interview anyone around the world now using the apps that are available.
To go just a little bit more technical, a lot of the big podcast networks will use Skype. That's what I think by and large people use for conducting remote interviews. But you have to coach your person on the other end of the line, your interviewee, a bit. Make sure where they're at, it's quiet. Make sure they have a decent microphone. Just give them some tips beforehand so that you don't lose any of that quality that you have at your home base.
I've found a lot of people still do interviews on the telephone, which can be technically a challenge, but there's some great software now where you can sweeten even the worst phone call conversation and make it sound usable. So, but ideally, yeah, if they have a microphone, that's the best way to do it for sure.
Are all your video, you said there were certain tiers in your membership, as some people get video content.
Yes.
Is that live streaming video, or is that
For the top tier, I also do a monthly live stream event for an hour where I do a Q&A, and sometimes we have guests on that as well, but that's just a monthly thing. Now, the videos that I send out on a weekly or bi-weekly basis to the upper echelon subscribers are just creative things that I do. And it doesn't have to be much. I mean, it's surprising what people really want. If they respond to your work, what they really want is access to you, the person. They want to know about you, you know? I was hard pressed for a video one week, and I was taking my kid to Chuck E. Cheese, and I was like, fuck it, I'm gonna film us going to Chuck E. Cheese. And it was like me playing basketball and the kid winning tickets and eating pizza. People went nuts for it. They loved it because it was just a glimpse into the life of somebody that they already like. You know, it's getting to know a friend that much better. You'd be surprised how little it takes to make people happy, as long as it's real. If you sit down and you're just staring down the barrel into a camera and you're blowing shit up their ass, it's not as effective. Again, I go back to what I said earlier. It's just the real interaction with people seems to be the key. At least that's what I found.
Once you've taken 20 years to make yourself an overnight success,
Yes,
right?
that's all. I forgot to mention that part. Do radio for 20 years and then get into podcasting. That's what I meant to say.
Yes, ma'am, back there.
I have 2 questions, if you don't mind.
I don't mind.
One is, do you ever discuss topics suggested to you by PR people? And number 2 is, if you had a good friend who didn't have a 20-year audience and really wanted to start a podcast and had a niche, would you tell them, don't be stupid, or would you encourage them to do it?
Well, I guess that would depend on the niche. Because, I mean, look, it's the best of times and the worst of times, right? We've got all this access. Anyone can be a television star on YouTube, and anyone can be a radio star with a podcast, which means you get voices heard that were never heard before that are amazing. But then you also get a bunch of shit that is just unlistenable. And it's an equal measure of both. And I would say it to someone, if you had a real point of view and you had something to really say and you thought you had an entertaining way to say it, then absolutely do it, because you got nothing to lose at this point, you know? I mean, but the key is, can you cut through the noise? There's so much competition out there. Can you find a way to make yourself heard? And either that's with a really unique point of view. I mean, there was a time when there was only one true crime podcast out there and everybody was interested in that, and then that caught fire, so then there's a bunch of copycats. I mean, it's a copycat industry like everything else in the entertainment business. So I wouldn't suggest they do a well, you know, ground that's been well trod by other podcasts. I wouldn't suggest they try to fight against someone who's already got a head start on them. But if they have a unique point of view, then absolutely. And in terms of PR people, I love getting people who have something interesting to talk about, because I'm looking for content, right? I've got an hour to fill every day. And don't get me wrong, I find myself fascinating, but it couldn't hurt once in a while to talk about something else other than me. And I've had the strangest luck with just talking to regular people. Here's the thing, I feel it's my responsibility to make an interview interesting. I don't depend upon the other person I'm interviewing to deliver. That's not their job. Their job is to be available to me. I should be the guy who makes it interesting. And I had a thing early on my podcast called the Job Mob, where I would talk to anyone and say, if you have an interesting job, send me an email, and I'm gonna do an interview with you, and I'm gonna put it on my show. And a guy sent me an email and said, I'm a window washer. And I said, great, let's have an interview. And I called him up on Skype, and we did a half an hour on window washing, and it turns out, you wouldn't believe what this guy saw through windows as he was washing them. Now, ordinarily, your mind doesn't think, a window washer, who wants to hear that guy talk? Everybody's got a story. There's a million people out there with fascinating lives. It's your job to get to it. You're panning gold in the stream, right? And a lot of it is dirt and silt and rocks, and then it's your job to get to the nuggets. And it was great, often. Sometimes it was a stinker, but I pre-record everything, so I can always shit can a piece if it doesn't work, or I can cut it up and make it short, or I can make fun of it after the fact. There's always a way to use content. But when people, I had several people reach out to me, PR people, who had known me from the radio show and through other contacts and stuff. And they have pitched me guests that maybe a lot of other people would have turned down. And I always like to think that I can find something interesting to talk about with almost anybody. I ended up talking to the guy who does the live directing on The Bachelor.
Well, that's fascinating.
That's fascinating, right? Now, most people want to talk to the Bachelor or the Bachelorette or the girl who's, you know, in the bathtub full of whipped cream because she wants to get a rose or whatever, however that works. But for me, it's like, this guy's been in the trenches. He knows what it's like. What's he cutting to? How is he seeing that world? And shooting reality television live is fascinating to me. And we made it work. It was great. So if there's any PR people in the audience who want to pitch me guests or clients or causes or charities, or if you've got a client, bring it on, because I like talking about people to people. I think that's interesting. You know, don't get me wrong, if you represent any stars, I'll take those too, sure. Why not?
AJ.
I have a question, a couple of questions back. You mentioned it doesn't take very much to get people to like you. Something, well, I'm paraphrasing.
No, I'd say content, it doesn't take a lot of thought to go into the content if people like you, because what they really want is interaction. They want access to you. So I don't need to produce a TV show to entertain people. I could take my kid to Chuck E. Cheese's and show them that video, and they enjoy that. That's what I meant. Yeah.
I wanted to spin it on in the other direction, because I think I happen to listen, and I think you do something interesting, an interesting segment. You took people who don't like you, in a sense, the exit.
Oh, yes.
I think you did a kind of an interesting thing, spinning it on its axis and how to handle people who might necessarily not like you.
Yes, this goes back to my idea, which is everything is content. And that's the one thing I learned in morning radio that I took with me, which was everything is usable content. And what AJ is alluding to is Patreon.com has a charming feature where if you unsubscribe from someone's content, if you drop the subscription, you get to fill out an exit survey on the way out. So you get to say all the shitty things that you don't like about them as you're walking out the door, and it's anonymous. And you know that brings out the best in people when they're anonymous. So I was reading these exit surveys of people who would leave the show, and it was crushing. You know, nothing's worse than reading people say horrible things about your work and my show now is very sort of personal, because I involve my wife and my kid. I mean, and so they're saying they're boring. Who cares about your daughter? And I'm like, oh my God, I'm dying here. And that's when it struck me. God bless, I stole a bit from Jimmy Kimmel, who's a friend of mine, so he won't mind. But he does this mean tweets thing, right, on his show, where he has the actual person read the mean tweets about themselves. And I was like, this is a golden opportunity. We should do mean exit surveys where I'll just get the worst of the worst, and we'll sit there and I'll read them out loud, and I'll own it, and we'll laugh about it. It's freeing. Once you sort of, if you own that stuff and you just absorb it and you say, okay, fine, I'm going to take it and I'm going to turn it into content, it changed the whole situation for me. So now I'm like eagerly going to the exit surveys, trying to find really awful things to say about me so I can store them up for the next session. So.
Yes, sir.
Could you say a little about your friendship with Eddie Pence?
Eddie Pence,
How long
yes.
you've known him, and have you gotten to know him so much more since he's been on?
Eddie Pence, for those
The
who don't know,
co-host, yeah.
yes, Eddie Pence, for those who don't know, the show is my sidekick. I call him the vice host because his last name is Pence, and so we thought that'd be funny. He always says, "Not that Pence." He's the vice host, and Eddie was a longtime acquaintance of mine. He's a stand-up comedian, and as I mentioned, I do the show Hollywood Babylon with Kevin Smith, which we've always done in front of a live audience as an interactive thing. And we've done it now for years at the Improv on Melrose, and for years before that, we did it at a comedy club that was owned by John Lovitz from Saturday Night Live at Universal City Walk. He had a comedy club there, and then he fucked us out of a bunch of money, so we stopped going there. But thank you. I'm an asshole. Acting. So Eddie Pence, I would see him at these club after club after club, and he would linger after his show or after our show, and we would hang out and talk to each other. And I always thought he was such a sweet, nice guy. And then sometimes he would pitch in, you know, we'd be selling merch at a table at the Hollywood Improv, and he'd get back there and he would hawk t-shirts and stuff. I mean, he's just such a good guy. And so I started doing the Ralph Report, and the solo thing was not working. And I was like, okay, I'm working out of my house, and my schedule is all over the place. I got to record whenever I can record. Who do I know that has no real obligations in life? who could be as flexible as I need them to be. And I was like, a stand-up comedian, of course. They work sporadically. Sometimes when they do work, they're working late at night. So I reached out to Eddie and I said, I know this is going to sound weird, but would you be interested in a daily co-hosting job on this podcast with me? And he said, well, let's try it out. So he came over and we started working together. And I realized, I always thought he was this nice, sweet guy, but he's just really weird too. And that's what you want in a co-host, is a weirdo. I mean, he won't eat like orange stuff. It's strange. He won't eat cheese curls because the dust on his hands, he says, reminds him of sand. And he got a lot of sand in his pants at the beach when he was a kid. I mean, this guy's a weirdo. But for a year, he walked around in junior high school, couldn't get the smell of ham out of his nose. I said he was haunted by a ghost ham. I mean, who smells ham all the time, 24 hours a day for a year? This guy's a gold mine. That's what you want if you're a host of a show, is to have a nut bar sitting next to you, because there's always something to go to. So I've learned about Eddie that he's not the sweet, nice guy I always thought he was. He's nuts. But it's very useful for me. So, but we're getting closer, and our friendship is growing, and it's been a real experience to get to know him and hang out with him. And it benefited him too, because the Garmy, as they are known, has come along and fallen in love with him. And now he's got his own fan base, subset of the Garmy, and they call themselves the Idiots. So it all works out.
How much do you rely on stats? Obviously, you have a subscription to your show.
Yes.
But talk about stats, how you find stats, when you do the stats, how are they relevant to what you do?
In terms of downloads and things like that?
Subscriptions down below, yes.
Yeah, I mean, subscriptions, that's hard. That's a hard number. That's real money, facts of life kind of numbers. Now, here's the thing. We talked about how do you expose yourself, not that way, to an audience. And early on, when I joined Patreon, I was like, well, this is it, and if people want to hear me, they can pay for it, and I have value, and that all went out the window because I needed more people. And so I talked to someone at Patreon and said, hey, are you used to the freemium model? And I was like, what's the freemium model? It's like, most of your content is premium, but some of it is free. And I was like, well, how would I do that? And he said, well, you do a show 5 days a week? And I said, yes. He goes, throw one day out to the general public a week. If people really like your show and they like you, they won't mind so much. They won't feel like they're getting ripped off because there's a free show floating around there. And so I put that show up on SoundCloud, and it gets sent out to Stitcher and iTunes and all the usual suspects. And I'm looking at those numbers. Those stats are very telling, because even though right now I hover at around 6,000 subscribers to my podcast, 6,000 paying subscribers. When I look at the free one, it's like 20,000 downloads. I mean, people are still in the mindset where they are more apt to listen to something for free than if they have to pay for it. But the interesting thing is, now we're a little over a year, well over a year now that we've been alive. And just now we're starting to get a ton of people come and say, you know what? It's frustrating me now because I listen to the free show and you talk about what you're going to be talking about tomorrow, and I don't get that show. So now I'm willing to join. I'm willing to subscribe. And it's like moving a tanker ship sometimes. Sometimes the direction you're going in, it's incremental, but if you stay in the game long enough, you start to feel like you're going in the right direction. So those kind of stats matter to me. If I can somehow generally monitor how many people are hearing what I do, and then if I can in real time start to see it pay off dividends, even if it's a year, 6 months down the road, those are the ones that I pay attention to. That's just me.
There's some podcast hosting platforms that people will use because the hosting platform, they have names like Libsyn and Blueberry, and they're inexpensive ways for anybody to host a podcast, and they're also the way that you distribute it out to Apple Podcasts and Spotify, all the other podcast players. And that's where your stats live. Whoever is hosting your show, that's where your stats live. And so they're really important for, I think, in both worlds, the advertising and the non-advertising, because they still equal revenue. So the more paying subscribers he has, obviously, and the bigger the audience you have, the more we can charge for advertising if we're selling advertising in your show. So it has everything to do with the business of podcasting.
And also, may I recommend, if you're doing a podcast, make sure you build yourself a pretty decent website as well. It's really a useful tool, because a lot, we found at least with SoundCloud and other sources, you can't really find out any information about the people who are listening to your show. But if you can drive them to your website, then through MailChimp or some other service, you can get actual email addresses and then use that for marketing at some other point if they'll sign up to your mailing list or, whatever, what's the letter you put out? The newsletter, yeah, that's it, thank you. Newbie.
I've been listening since the K-Rock days.
Thank you.
And you mentioned about everything being content. One of the biggest moments that stands out that I can recall from really connecting with you was when you talked about what you were going through with your wife when the twins were born.
Yes.
And that was...
Let me put some context on that before you finish. Again, we're talking about everything being content. My wife and I had a hard time getting pregnant, and so we used IVF, and my wife was carrying twins, and we delivered early, and we had two twins. Of course you do, you have two twins. We had twins, Olivia and Lincoln, and Olivia survived, and my son Lincoln passed away at 10 days of age. And I went back on the radio. Well, first of all, I felt an obligation when I went back on the radio to talk about it.
That's kind of my question is, do you ever feel like, that's my life, like, how much is, do you feel like, did I step into something that I didn't want to share? How much of me do I have to put out there? Do you ever feel like you had to kind of give up some of your own personal stuff because everything is content?
No, you're still in charge of it. I mean, everybody's in charge of what they do and what they don't do when they're creating. The reason I felt, I wouldn't even say obligated, the reason I wanted to talk about it when I came back was twofold. One is because you can't believe, and again, this goes back to being friends with your audience or them feeling like you're their friend. In my darkest days, and that was certainly one of them, the outpouring of love and affection from the audience was ridiculous and life-saving in a lot of ways. I'm sorry I get choked up now, I'm just still talking about it. So many kind words and thoughts and emails and prayers, and it was overwhelming. For me to go back on the radio in front of those people and not address what had happened would have been inauthentic. It would have been unfair, it would have been wrong of me. So did I want to go on the air and talk about my son passing away? Obviously not. But again, like reading those angry exit surveys on the way out, there's something healing about owning that shit and sharing it, even if it's to a faceless audience out there in the ether that's listening to you on the radio or on a podcast. There's something empowering about taking your worst stuff and doing something creative with it. I didn't think anybody was entertained by the story about my son dying. I wasn't foolish enough to think that. But I think they felt a connection with them that had value. And I think there's something to that. It's not all about chuckles and laughs. Sure, that's the great stuff. And my favorite things are when people come up and saying, you know what, I was going through a worst day and your show gave me a laugh or took my mind off something that was horrible happening. That's a gift when people say that to me. But I think people also hunger for human interaction, to know that, wow, this person has gone through shit too, and so have I, and I feel now we're even more connected in that way. It being real, being authentic, I think is, again, the most important part. But within that, set your limits, set your boundaries. You don't have to talk about anything you don't want to. When I started this new show, I wanted this to be more of me than I had ever let people into before. Because I always sort of played versions of myself. Kevin and Bean Show, I was a version of myself. The Hollywood Babylon is certainly, it's like a comedy team. We sort of have personas. I'm the angry drunk guy, Kevin's the sweet stoner guy, and that's the shtick. This, my wife comes in and sits in with me, and my kid does reviews for kids' movies, and we sit down and we review kids' films together, and it's the most me that I've ever been in anything that I've done. And the people who enjoy it seem to really enjoy it. So.
Sorry, didn't make you cry.
No, I cry like that. I'm drunk. Most of the time, I'm drunk.
So yeah, I was just gonna say, if you want to, do you want to wrap it up with 3 things that for people to leave with? Be real, be funny, and be ready for a lot of work.
Yeah, this is not a game for people without a strong work ethic. That's for sure. I was kidding before, but I am working harder now than I have in a long, long time.
Yeah, me too.
And that's one of my strong suits. Again, it's something I knew I can handle because It's been that way my whole career. When I started in radio, I started because of Jimmy Kimmel. He got me into radio, and I'll never forgive him, that son of a bitch. No, he introduced me to Kevin Bean, and he got me that gig. And he said to Kevin and Bean, "You're going to like this guy. Yeah, he's funny and all, but he works his ass off." And that's always been a skill set I knew I possessed. I may not be the most talented guy in the room or the funniest guy in the room, but I work hard, and people can count on me to do that. And if you're starting your own podcast, you're going to have to count on yourself to do that, because it's an enormous amount of work, but it absolutely can pay off big dividends, not just financially, although we all wish for that. But the work that I'm doing now, and it's funny, you know, I was an actor for many years, and I did radio, and I've done podcasts, and I've done stage, and I've done all different kinds of things. This daily show that I'm doing is the most fun and sort of the most rewarding stuff that I've done, despite the work. It's because you get to be your own boss, and you get to talk about what you want to talk about, and there's no guy sitting in an office somewhere telling you, nobody wants to hear anybody talk to each other anymore, you know? Now, you know, people do want to hear you talk, and you can do that.
No guys sitting in offices telling us what to do. I like that.
Exactly, yes.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you so much.